Hey everyone, this is a slightly different video from me this week because this has been something that's been on my mind since I originally played this game, and when I did, it really confused me, and so when I recently replayed it, it got me thinking about a lot of the different ideas going on in the game, and so I decided to make a video about it. Now, as you can see from the video, this is about Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. Now, this was a game that was released in 2015, and I previously spoke about it briefly on my video about walking simulators and why I love them, and I suggest you watch that video to get more of a feel for the history of the genre and why I think they're important. Now, this game was created by the Chinese room and was rated by gamers and critics alike when it first released. It won multiple awards, and its graphics and content were highly praised, as was its soundtrack, which is just hauntingly beautiful. So the game begins with no explanations, and you start outside of a village. The sun is shining, it's beautiful, but there's not a person in sight. From there, you can walk around the village and the surrounding area. Where you start, you can see an observatory, except you can't get in, the gate is locked, and so you kind of get a feeling that this area is somewhere you're going to end up, and you do by the end of the game. But first, you take a walk through the village, the fields surrounding it, the local campsite, and a few other areas, all while slowly unravelling a very strange story. As the game progresses, you learn about the scientists at the observatory, who are called Kate and Stephen, who are married, and they were tracking a light anomaly that appeared in the night sky. It begins to attempt to communicate with them, but in doing so kills the cows and birds in the valley, which a lot of the villagers notice, which adds to this area of sort of separation between the scientists and the locals, even though Stephen was actually born in the valley. The strange light then moves on to infecting humans, who either disappear or report symptoms that are similar to hemorrhaging, bleeding out of the nose and mouth, and eventually passing away as well, presumably, although there are no bodies in the game. The game is completely void of all violence except through descriptions from the locals about what's happening to them. Stephen quickly realises that this illness is spreading, and it seems to be spreading through telephones, radios, etc. He has the valley quarantined before the light can move on to the surrounding area, but by doing so condemns the people of the valley that he knows personally, but also prevents the spread of the illness. Some people die from the bleeding, whilst others are almost exalted by the light, and you see this as you're playing the game. You see these orbs wandering round, which you can follow, which then tell you part of the story, and then at the end of major moments in the story, you'll watch these sort of light versions of people slowly kind of fade away and become particles of white light spreading off into the world. Eventually, with the knowledge that they are all infected, Stephen convinces the local government to bomb the valley, killing all of the residents, but subsequently preventing the light from moving on to somewhere new. The locals congregate in certain areas, such as the village hall, and also the summer camp where they put on a play for the children to try and keep them calm. This is a brutal story in some ways because you're having to contend with all of these quite awful things happening, but they've already happened and you're kind of watching like an afterglow of them instead. The game ends with you finally confronting this original light at the observatory, and as you connect with it, the world fades away to nothing and everything is just light. So this can be a difficult game to follow, and I left my first run through unsure of what I had just played. On a second go though, things started to make a little bit more sense, and I started to recognise more nuanced parts of the story, so it is one that I recommend replaying if you have time. Don't just leave it to one go through, because I think you miss out on some of the really deep sort of morals that are going on here and themes that are going on here. So on a second go through, things started to make a bit more sense. The lights you are following around the village and surrounding area become clearly what are left of people who lived there and who want you to know their story. I find the orbs kind of strangely playful, like they kind of tempt you to follow them, but then they don't go slow enough for you to keep up with them, but then they'll sometimes wait for you, and they kind of have personalities. I think that might just be me reading into a game, but I think that's also part of why we game, is we read into the stories for ourselves. The most obvious example I can give that proves that these lights are the locals whose stories you're learning about are the one from Lizzie's section. So Lizzie is a young woman who was crippled after an accident and who has begun an affair with Stephen, who she was romantically involved in before he left. And so when he returns to the valley, they kind of restart a relationship, which is based on equalness between them, but there's also some complexity there because obviously Stephen is married, but also Kate, his wife, is finding it very hard to connect with the locals of the village. It's implied that she is not white, and so some of the villagers may have an issue with that, although that's not a big theme. I think it's more to do with the fact that she's an American who has come to this very British, very secluded area and is kind of stuck there and is very lonely, and Stephen recognises that but also can't help her with that, and so he ends up reverting back and falling in love with this woman Lizzie, who runs the caravan sites. During her area of the game, which is, as I said, the holiday place, the light that you follow has one key difference to the other orbs that you'll see, which lets you know as the player that you're following her specifically. Now, this is the addition of another orb that's very small that stays by her side at all times, and it kind of dances around her orb as you're following it. At the beginning, this may seem a bit odd because no other orb has had this, but as the story progresses, you learn that at the time of her death, Lizzie was in fact carrying Stephen's child, which is why she was attempting to leave through the train station when the original light creature exalted her. The smaller orb is presumably then her unborn child, which became part of her story and therefore is part of the trail you must follow. The cipher at the end of the game also opens up a huge argument for this. So as the credits roll, at one point there is just a string of numbers and nothing more, no explanation. However, if you freeze frame that and copy down the numbers and then change the numbers for letters where 1 equals A, 2 equals B, and so on, a message appears. And this is a quote from a man called Douglas Hofstadter. And it says, "In the wake of a human being's death, what survives is a set of afterglows, some brighter and some dimmer in the collective brains of those dearest to them. There is, in those who remain, a collective corona that still glows." Now, for those of you that may have picked up on a certain word at the end there, this game came out way before the 2020 virus pandemic, but the word is still important. So it can actually mean two things. First, it's a part of the body likened to a crown. And secondly, it's the gaseous envelope of the sun or other stars which is only visible during a solar eclipse. Given this game flits between day and night, quite strangely, when you're kind of watching particularly the exalted moments of this game, the sun will disappear, the stars will come out, and you can kind of see constellations very, very clearly. So I think both definitions of this word are appropriate in this case. What you are seeing as you walk around are the impacts that these people have made on their world and the people in them. These connections meant that they are never truly alone. There's an interesting moment towards the end of the game where you can hear Kate speaking on a recording, and she explains that the light shouldn't have done what it did to Lizzie, i.e. kill her when she was trying to escape through the train station, but it didn't understand why she was trying to leave, which caused it to force her to stay for Stephen. It's got like a childish understanding of human connection and human relationships. It becomes clear that the light is interested in people's connections and not wanting them to be alone, but has misconstrued that, which has led to deaths in the valley as it tries to force them to stay. Which leads me to the last revelation of this game, which is one that everyone will have their own personal view of. Who are you playing as in this game? I personally believe you are inhabiting Kate, who felt so alone in this new place with these people who didn't accept her and a husband she couldn't communicate with. After everyone else has found their connection and moved on, she remains. That is until the end of the game when she realises she understands the light and merges with it, exalting herself and being able to move on. This is an incredibly powerful game and one that I actually find comfort in, particularly in the last few years of our own pandemic. It shows that even in isolation, there are ways to connect, and even the most heartbreaking of stories deserve to be heard. I look forward to seeing what the Chinese room move on to next. They have been in development of an unannounced title since October 2020, and if it's anything like its predecessors, we are in for one hell of a ride.